I never imagined the most expensive piece of real estate in my neighborhood would turn out to be a strip of concrete barely wide enough for one car. But apparently my driveway was worth more to my neighbor than the one attached to her own house. Before I get into how she ended up spending well over $800 trying to park there for free, let me tell you how something that started with a polite note slowly turned into one of the strangest lessons I've ever learned about boundaries, entitlement, and the fact that sometimes the calmest response ends up hurting the most. My name is Ethan Brooks, and back in the spring of 2020, I bought my first home in a quiet neighborhood just outside Franklin Ridge, Ohio. It wasn't some dream mansion, just a modest ranch house with a single-car garage, a neat little front porch, and a freshly poured concrete driveway that could fit exactly 2 vehicles if you parked carefully. I loved that place because every inch of it represented years of overtime shifts, skipped vacations, and saying no to things I wanted because I had one goal: owning something that was mine. The neighborhood itself seemed peaceful. Kids rode bicycles after school, people waved while walking their dogs, and every Saturday somebody was either mowing a lawn or washing a truck. It felt like the kind of place where everyone respected each other without having to say much. Across the fence lived a couple named Dana and Rick Holloway. Rick worked construction and owned 2 aging pickup trucks that rarely left the driveway at the same time. Dana drove a silver sedan and, from what I could tell, spent most mornings rearranging flower pots instead of actually gardening. They weren't unfriendly exactly, just the kind of neighbors who always acted as though the rules somehow bent a little for them. Their garage door was almost never open, but on the few occasions I caught a glimpse inside, I understood why. It was packed from floor to ceiling with old furniture, broken shelves, unopened moving boxes, Christmas decorations in the middle of July, and enough forgotten junk to furnish 3 houses. Instead of cleaning it out, they simply parked outside. And eventually, outside wasn't enough anymore. One afternoon, I came home from work carrying groceries and found Dana's sedan sitting squarely in the middle of my driveway. At first, I actually thought maybe one of her relatives had some emergency or perhaps someone had mistaken the houses. I wasn't angry. Honestly, I was more confused than anything else. So I wrote a short note on a sticky pad. "Hi, I think you accidentally parked in my driveway. Would you mind moving your car? Thanks." I tucked it under the windshield wiper and went inside. About 20 minutes later, the car disappeared. No apology, no explanation. Still, mistake made, mistake fixed. End of story. Or so I believed. A week later, it happened again. This time, I walked across the yard and knocked on their front door. Dana answered wearing gardening gloves even though there wasn't a shovel in sight. She smiled like we were old friends. "Oh, Ethan," she laughed. I was only there for a couple minutes. I almost accepted that answer until I checked the notification history from my doorbell camera later that evening. Her car hadn't been there for 2 minutes. It had been sitting on my driveway for 46 minutes before I even got home. She had looked directly into my camera while getting out of the car, then casually walked inside her house carrying a cup of coffee. That wasn't confusion. That wasn't an accident. That was a decision. I still didn't want a neighborhood feud, though. My parents always raised me to solve problems with conversations before lawyers, police, or paperwork ever became necessary. So I let it go one more time. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was a Saturday. I was making pancakes when my phone buzzed with another motion alert. I glanced at the screen expecting another delivery driver. Instead, I watched Dana pull into my driveway with complete confidence. She stepped out, locked the doors, adjusted her sunglasses, and walked toward her front porch without even looking back. She didn't hesitate. She didn't appear embarrassed. She acted like she parked exactly where she belonged. Standing there with the spatula still in my hand, I realized something that honestly annoyed me more than the parking itself. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped asking because she'd convinced herself she didn't have to. That was the exact moment I stopped treating the situation like a misunderstanding. From then on, every single visit became evidence. Every arrival time, every departure, every camera clip, every photograph, every date went into a folder on my laptop. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't looking for a fight. I simply decided that if this ever became more than an annoying neighbor dispute, I wanted facts instead of feelings. And I had no idea just how valuable those facts were about to become. The folder on my laptop kept growing. And after about 2 weeks, I realized something interesting. Dana almost never parked in my driveway on days when she knew I was home. She did it when my truck was gone, when she assumed I was working late or early in the morning before most people on the street were awake. That told me she understood exactly what she was doing. People who genuinely believe they're right don't usually wait until nobody is watching. People who know they're crossing a line become surprisingly good at choosing their timing. I added that observation to my notes, not because I thought it would matter legally, but because it mattered to me. It answered the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the second incident. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't carelessness. It was convenience wrapped in confidence. A few days later, I called the city's non-emergency police line, explained the situation calmly, and made it clear that I wasn't asking anyone to arrest my neighbor over a parking space. I just wanted the complaint documented. The dispatcher appreciated that approach, and later that afternoon, Officer Melissa Grant stopped by. She walked the property with me, looked at the security footage, confirmed the driveway was entirely within my property line, and nodded before saying, "You've been more patient than most people would have been." She crossed the street and spoke with Dana for about 5 minutes. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see Dana throwing her hands in the air as if the whole thing was ridiculous. Officer Grant returned, handed me a small incident card with the report number written across the bottom, and said, "She's been advised not to park here again. If it continues, you've got documentation that we spoke with her today." I thanked her, honestly believing that would be the end of it. It seemed impossible that someone would ignore a direct warning from a police officer over something so unnecessary. The next morning, I learned how wrong I was. I had barely poured my first cup of coffee when my phone vibrated again. Motion detected. I opened the camera feed and actually laughed out loud because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Dana's silver sedan rolled into my driveway like nothing had happened the previous day. She stepped out carrying 2 reusable grocery bags, locked the doors, and disappeared into her house. I remember sitting there staring at the screen thinking, "You were literally warned yesterday." That's when frustration gave way to curiosity. What makes someone believe consequences are always for other people? Instead of reacting emotionally, I spent that weekend reading through Franklin Ridge's municipal ordinances concerning unauthorized vehicles on private residential property. It wasn't exciting reading, but buried in the legal language was a process that was remarkably straightforward. If the homeowner posted city-compliant warning signs in visible locations, waited the required 72 hours after installation, and registered the property with a licensed towing contractor, any unauthorized vehicle left on the driveway could legally be removed at the owner's expense. No arguments, no courtroom, no asking permission from the person blocking your property. Just a clearly defined procedure. I must have read that section 5 times because it almost seemed too simple. On Monday after work, I drove to the city's permit office and asked the clerk 3 separate questions to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding anything. She smiled and said, "Most people never bother reading the ordinance before they call us. You're doing it the right way." That sentence stuck with me. Doing it the right way. Not the fastest way, not the loudest way, the right way. That evening, I ordered 2 reflective aluminum warning signs with lettering that matched the city's specifications exactly. Unauthorized vehicles will be towed at owner's expense. The signs weren't aggressive. They weren't personal. They simply stated the law. 3 days later, I installed one beside the garage and another near the sidewalk where nobody entering the driveway could honestly claim they hadn't seen them. I photographed both signs from multiple angles with timestamps, emailed the pictures to myself, and saved copies inside the same evidence folder. Then I contacted Ridgeline Recovery Services, the towing company authorized by the city, completed their property authorization paperwork, and provided copies of my deed and identification. The dispatcher chuckled softly as she finished entering my information. "Hopefully you'll never need us," she said. I smiled. Honestly, I hope so too. For 4 quiet days, nothing happened. Every time I glanced out the front window, my driveway was exactly as it should be, empty except for my truck. I almost convinced myself Dana had finally gotten the message. Maybe the police warning had sunk in after all. Maybe the signs had embarrassed her just enough to stop. Then Friday afternoon arrived. I pulled into my garage after work, changed into an old t-shirt, and started trimming the hedges along the front walk. Around 6 o'clock, I went inside for a bottle of water. My phone buzzed before I even reached the refrigerator. Motion detected. I opened a live feed and there she was. Dana turned smoothly into my driveway, parked directly beneath one of the bright reflective warning signs, climbed out, looked briefly in the direction of my house, then walked across the lawn toward her own front door carrying nothing but her purse. She had looked straight at the sign. There was no doubt about it. She simply chose to ignore it. I stood in my kitchen for several seconds. Not angry anymore, just strangely calm. I reached into my wallet, pulled out the incident card Officer Grant had given me, looked at the report number 1 last time, then picked up my phone and called Ridgeline Recovery. Unauthorized vehicle, unregistered property, I said. The dispatcher recognized my address immediately. We'll have someone there in about 20 minutes. Thank you, I replied. And that was the entire conversation. No shouting, no confrontation, no knocking on doors. I walked onto my back patio with a glass of iced tea, sat down in the shade, and listened to birds instead of arguments. 23 minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of a diesel tow truck turning onto our street. The driver backed carefully into position, checked the property authorization already on file, photographed the warning signs, photographed the vehicle, and began securing the front wheels with practiced efficiency. A couple walking their dog slowed down to watch. Across the street, an older neighbor watering his lawn quietly nodded in my direction as if to say, "About time." By the time Dana finally opened her front door after nearly an hour, her sedan was already halfway up the hydraulic lift. She sprinted across the grass, waving both arms. "Wait, wait, that's my car." The driver remained perfectly calm. "Ma'am, once the vehicle is attached and paperwork has been completed, I can't release it on site." She pointed straight at my house. "Did he call you?" The driver glanced at me sitting on my patio. The property owner requested service under an active authorization agreement. Dana stormed toward me, her face bright red. "Are you seriously towing my car?" I took one slow sip of tea before answering. "No, Dana. The towing company is. I'm just following the same ordinance the police officer explained to both of us." For the first time since this whole situation began, she had absolutely nothing to say. Nathan stayed on my porch for another few seconds, almost like he was waiting for me to soften. But there wasn't really anything left to negotiate. I'd spent nearly 2 months trying to solve the problem face to face. Every polite conversation had been brushed aside with a joke, a shrug, or that same tired line about neighbors sharing. The truth was, neighbors do share. They share respect, they share consideration, they share the understanding that somebody else's property isn't yours simply because it's convenient. What they had been doing wasn't sharing, it was taking. Quietly, repeatedly, and confidently enough that they eventually convinced themselves it was normal. Before leaving, Nathan looked down at the paperwork one last time and muttered, "I still think this could have been handled differently." I nodded. It could have. The first day, I asked. He didn't answer. He simply turned, climbed into his truck, and drove away without slamming the door this time. The lake was unusually quiet over the next several days. Word traveled fast around a small waterfront community. I noticed neighbors slowing their boats as they passed my shoreline, looking toward the dock that had suddenly become the most talked about piece of lumber on the lake. Some waved. Some avoided eye contact completely. A few probably thought I'd gone too far. Others quietly appreciated that somebody had finally done what everyone else had complained about for years, but never acted on. The following Tuesday, I stopped by the local hardware store for stain-in replacement screws for one of the dock benches. Before I even reached the checkout counter, an older gentleman named Walter, who had lived on the opposite side of a lake for nearly 30 years, smiled and asked, "You're the fellow with the impounded boats, aren't you?" I laughed because apparently that was my new identity. He leaned against his shopping cart and said something that stayed with me. "You're not the first person they've done that to. You're just the first one who decided enough was enough." That surprised me. Over the next 15 minutes, he told me about fishing boats tied to private docks, picnic tables used without permission, people plugging extension cords into strangers' outdoor outlets because it was easier than carrying a generator. Most homeowners simply rolled their eyes and let it happen because nobody wanted to become known as the difficult neighbor. Driving home, I kept thinking about that. Maybe the biggest reason entitled behavior spreads isn't because it's accepted. Maybe it's because decent people hate confrontation so much that they slowly surrender little pieces of their boundaries, one compromise at a time. By the end of the week, Nathan's boats were still sitting in the county impound yard collecting storage fees every single day. Then, 9 days after the tow, his pickup rolled slowly into my driveway again. This time there was no anger, no audience, no dramatic entrance. He stepped out carrying a large manila envelope under one arm and walked toward me while I was replacing one of the weathered cedar boards near the end of the dock. "Mind if we talk?" he asked. His voice sounded different, quieter. I set my drill down and nodded. For a few seconds, he simply looked across the lake before finally speaking. The storage fees ended up being a lot worse than I expected. I didn't say anything. He continued. Insurance denied everything. They said unauthorized mooring isn't an accident. It's negligence. He actually laughed at himself then. The kind of laugh people make when reality has finally caught up with their confidence. I guess I spent a lot of money learning a lesson I should have learned for free. That was probably the first honest sentence I'd ever heard him say. I invited him to sit on the bench overlooking the water. We talked for nearly half an hour. Not about the impound fees, but about how the whole mess had started. He admitted that when they first tied up at my dock, they assumed I wouldn't care because I rarely used it during the busiest hours of the weekend. After I asked them to stop, he convinced himself I was simply being territorial rather than protecting something that genuinely mattered to me. I never thought about what that dock meant to you, he admitted. To me, it was just a place to tie a rope. I looked down at the cedar planks beneath our feet. To me, it was where my dad taught me how to fish. My daughter took her first cast right there. I pointed toward the end of the dock. My grandfather built every inch of this himself. Nathan followed my hand with his eyes. And for the first time, I could actually see him looking at the dock instead of just seeing a convenient parking spot. I didn't know that, he said quietly. He never asked, I answered. He nodded because there wasn't really another response. Before he left, I handed him a simple written mooring agreement I'd drafted after speaking with the county. It wasn't complicated. 30-day authorization, advance payment, maximum of 1 registered vessel, no overnight docking without written approval. No guests using the dock unless specifically listed. Leave the property exactly as you found it. Violate the agreement once. And the authorization ended immediately. Nathan read every line carefully this time. When he reached the signature line, he looked up and asked, "These aren't negotiable, are they?" I smiled. "Neither are property lines." For a second, he almost laughed, then finally signed his name. Watching him do that wasn't satisfying because I'd won. It was satisfying because the argument had finally become unnecessary. We no longer needed opinions. We had expectations written clearly enough that nobody could pretend to misunderstand them. The rest of the summer passed differently. Whenever Nathan wanted to bring his boat over, he sent a text first. If I planned to fish early the next morning, I'd simply tell him no. And surprisingly, that became the end of the conversation. No eye-rolling, no sarcastic comments, no speeches about public water. Just understood. Eventually, even his friends stopped wandering across my yard. The portable speakers stayed on their own property. My outdoor electrical outlet somehow lost its appeal. The atmosphere around the cove slowly returned to what it had been before the whole mess began. One evening near the end of September, I carried my coffee down to the dock just before sunrise. Exactly like I had done hundreds of mornings before. The water reflected the first orange light of the day, and the entire lake looked perfectly still. As I stood there, I realized the dock hadn't really changed at all. The cedar was still weathered. The old cleats still carried decades of scratches. The only thing that had changed was that every rope tied there now belonged exactly where it was. Respect had quietly replaced assumption. Looking back, I don't think the story was ever really about boats. Boats were just the symptom. The real issue was whether being a good neighbor means allowing people to ignore your boundaries in the name of keeping the peace. I've come to believe the opposite is true. Healthy communities exist because people respect one another's space, not because one person silently sacrifices theirs. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do isn't giving another chance. It's making expectations impossible to misunderstand. I'm still curious what you think. Did I let the law handle something that should have stayed between neighbors? Or did the situation stop being a simple neighbor dispute the moment repeated respect turned into repeated trespass? If you were standing where I was, watching strangers treat your property like public space week after week, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments because I genuinely like to hear both sides of the argument. And if you've ever dealt with entitled neighbors, waterfront disputes, or people who confused kindness with permission, tell us your story too. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.